The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. So I thought, yeah, good direction to go in would be to just look through the assessment and everything and just kind of get a sense of if and where, some of the areas are that maybe we might benefit from looking into in some more detail. I think for the most part, everything looked pretty good. I think for a lot of it, your answers were very much in line with the kind of thing that I think is reasonable. I think the big picture of what I would imagine is probably the best area to work on is there were a couple things that were maybe kind of skipping over a couple of important mechanics that I think are important. So there's a couple of things there that we can potentially just address. And then I think that there were also a couple of things related to stuff like pot odds versus MDF on the river. I think a lot of players tend to get those things mixed up, and it probably doesn't help that at various points, I think in some of the content that we put out with Solve for Why, I think we had times where we sort of struggled to really convey some of the major differences or the key sort of implications of some of these ideas. So there's a couple things there that maybe give me a thought that we might want to look at some river scenarios and some concepts about the river in a bit more detail. And also maybe just take a bit more of a focus on not so much the idea of MDF and pot odds and things like that being about defending our own range so much as being about telling us to what extent can we attack the opposing range, to what extent can we identify that our opponents are not obeying MDF or meeting MDF, and therefore there's weaknesses that we can exploit there. So there's a couple things there, but let me just share my screen and I'll kind of go through it. So I did make some notes on the doc itself on the Google Doc, so I can just kind of have something to refer to.
I did have a quick question about our last session. You said,
yeah, of course, go ahead.
What's my question? It was about, you said like we can play chip EV up until the registration is over. Does that include freeze outs or is it only for rebuy?
I don't think rebuy really changes anything. I think people make, for the most part, way too many changes to how they play in a freeze out compared to a re-entry. I think there's just almost no change that you should ever make, to be honest. Because for the most part, if you're playing a re-entry tournament and you have the ability to buy back in, it affects whether or not you decide to fire a second bullet after you already busted the first one, but it doesn't affect the EV of the first bullet. So there isn't really, there just isn't really any adaptation there that I think we need to make, really.
Global has a lot of global structures are strict freeze out one entry. So I was just wondering, like, play should EV even if we don't have the chance to rebuy, but that makes a lot of sense. It's like it shouldn't really affect our EV of the first bullet.
Right. And I think that it will, the funny thing is that it will affect the way other people play, but it doesn't actually affect the specifics of our own priorities and what the variables are that we're presented with, other than just affecting their ranges. So that's kind of how I would look at it. So
it's
for the most part, go ahead.
Sorry, it's something I might want to discuss more because like I spent so much time just thinking like, okay, levels 1 through 6, like, and that ends up with me getting to the bubble with a 20 big blind stack very frequently. So I think that'll change a lot of the way I look at tournaments, honestly.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that this is something that's kind of evolved a lot as we've now developed the ability to have, we have ICM sims for the early stages now that do exist. And what it comes down to is if you look at an ICM sim, I mean, places like Wizard have ICM sims that are actually run with 100% of the field still remaining. And it just looks like chip EV. It's just the same, it's like we didn't really used to talk about ICM in such concrete terms as to think about it in terms of risk premiums and to really understand like where the risk premiums are actually growing and shrinking. And now that we have HRC being able to run ICM sims for, hand one of the tournament, what we actually end up essentially seeing is that functionally early game ICM sims just basically look exactly like chip EV, more or less. So that's kind of what it amounts to. which we didn't have obviously when I made those courses about all the, the structures and things like that. So that certainly is a change. Cool. So looks like I made enough notes that it's put the comments kind of it doesn't completely match up with the actual text.
I've used Google Docs comments many times.
Yeah, it's kind of annoying. But anyway, I think for the most part, just looking at the first question here, everything was pretty reasonable. You know what? Maybe if I like up the text size, it might actually kind of align it a bit better. Let me just see if I can Control A and see if it does anything. And then, yeah, it actually does. Okay,
closer,
cool.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right, that worked. So the general idea here with this first question is, I think I was a little surprised that your example was a turn spot that you gave.
Yeah.
Just because I feel like I think the natural sort of progression or the natural connotation that is more logical to think of when we're thinking about polarized ranges is that they primarily exist on the river, right? So the turn spot is an example, like the example that you give where we're just kind of going 2E on the turn and everything. It's not that it's not an example of a polar strategy. It's just that inherently polarization is more practical and more distinctly optimal in certain very specific river situations.
Yeah. The second I read your comment, I was like, oh yeah, we just check our pairs back, or we check our middle pairs back on the river, and then we better with bluff. Yeah.
Right. Precisely. Yeah. So it's just kind of really like a river situation that mirrors like the ace, king, queen game, right? Just looking at that as a distinct example of a polar strategy. And then, obviously the other aspects of here of all this explanation, everything is accurate in terms of the impact that it has on our strategy. But I think that what was the comment that I put here?
It was the last one. I think you said on the turn, both hands still have equity. So it's
there's that, but there's also this first one here, which is basically that the polarity describes the range that's betting, and it is possible for a small size to use a polar range, and particularly at low SPRs where a large size would be an all-in size. What tends to happen is the non-all-in size will actually become more polar, and then the all-in size will be like a lot of sort of protection and a lot of like getting it in with hands that have good equity when called, but also aren't necessarily value. So I think that the connotation that we're looking for here really is just that the term refers to the range, and then a polarized strategy or a strategy of betting big with a polar range is a slightly different thing. So you've captured the vast majority of it here, but I think a river example might have served a little bit better.
Cool.
So right here, this first part certainly explains why this is incorrect. That's very accurate. What I would have liked to see, I think overall though, is an explanation of just as opposed to the kind of mechanics that come as a product of ICM, just sort of some mention of the fact that ICM is actually it's a model in itself, right? It's something that we use to calculate what the strategies look like, and it isn't a strategy in itself. People tend to refer to it as a strategy in itself. That means you just fold more on the bubble, which is kind of why I put this question in here. And the element that's missing in their understanding here is the idea that ICM isn't a strategy, basically, right? And that you captured the idea here that it can have a variety of effects, but you didn't really nail the reason why it can have a variety of effects, which is that it's a model, it's not a strategy, right? This one was really good. Number 3, the one about basically identifying a range bet here. I did run this in a sim, and I think it's like 83% C bet or something, 83% like small bet, 17% check or whatever. It's basically a range bet. So the idea here is we're just identifying that this is a more or less a range bet board. And the only thing that was maybe a little bit off here is 60 to 65% would be pretty wide to be opening at 30 bigs on button. We're probably looking at more like 45 here. When we're really deep, we get to open like 55, 57 on the button, something like that. But 60, 65 is more like either we're exploiting a tight big blind, or we are, we're adapting to some ICM where we have a big stack and we can just apply some pressure or something like that. The suited Jack
I think
X.
I probably opened 2 loose on the button. Like when I was playing cash, it was like, around 40, 45%. And then I just assumed like, well, we're usually using a smaller size, maybe not, like if we're using like 2.5. And then there's also Annies in it. So I just like started widening my range. And I think I don't get punished for it because like people just don't 3-bet.
You probably don't, which is why it's not really that disastrous of an error by any means. But I think it's worth noting though that when you're only 30 bigs effective, the general idea here is that your positional advantage doesn't count for as much. So if you were like 200 deep, you can really just kind of go kind of nuts on the button and just open super wide here. But at 30, there's just a much bigger downside to getting 3-bet with certain hands, and there's just a lot of hands, particularly the offsuit stuff, that really struggle in position when you're not even that deep.
The other thing I forgot is no rake. That's another reason why, like when I'm transitioning from one to the other, I'm like, oh yeah, well there's a rake and there's an extra big blind in the pot, so I should go for it more. But I should just look at some charts probably.
Sure, probably, yeah. I mean, you're certainly not wrong about that, but like this is, I think opening ranges are one of those areas where it's pretty low hanging fruit to just kind of understand broadly what your range looks like, and just to like people are very down on the idea of memorizing strategies, with good reason in most cases. But when it comes to pre-flop opening ranges, like you pretty much can memorize those quite easily, and you probably should, like you probably should just have a rough idea at least of the frequencies that exist for certain, kind of stack sizes. Like you're going to be opening like 17% under the gun 8, and you're going to be opening like 53% or so on the button, I think at about like 50, 60 bigs. And at 30, it's going to drop to something like 46, 47 on button, and it's going to increase to like 18 under the gun or something like that, because out of position is less of a downside. This description of the big blind defense range is a bit more accurate, just like kind of calling about 60%, maybe a bit more than that, and then 3-betting quite a bit. When I first saw this 75 to 80% of hands actually defending, I thought you were kind of referring to like only fold, like calling all of this and then 3-betting a bunch. But yeah, I mean, Jack 5 off, 8-6 off type stuff, this is a pretty reasonable assumption about what they're going to be defending. It is worth noting though that some of the offsuit, the connected stuff in the 8-6 off, 7-5 off kind of region is a much more natural defend than stuff like Jack 4 and below and 10-4 and stuff like that. So you're going to see these connected hands actually calling much more frequently than
I checked after the fact. It was like 5-3 is like a call and like 10-4 is a fold or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So you want connectivity as opposed to just a high card there. This is, I mean, you identified, a wide range bet basically. I don't really think the one big blind bet is that necessary in a lot of spots, honestly. I mean, it is a thing, particularly it's a thing in ICM. It's also a thing in like it's more of a thing on monotone boards, and sometimes on some certain paired boards and things like that. But there's kind of a lot to be said for, there is a point where your bet becomes small enough that
it's a check.
It's like it's a check with a little bit of fold equity, but at the same time, that doesn't really serve that much in comparison to checking, in that you're when you bet one big blind, you're supposed to get raised so often that if we're talking in optimal terms, like you actually would be better off checking and not reopening the betting, Right. There is kind of a point where, I think generally on the flop, there are some situations where one big blind is good, particularly when you're really shallow. If the big blind defends off a shallow stack, or you open off a shallow stack, there's certainly merit to that sometimes. But I think at 30, you can just go B25. Like, I don't think it's really an issue to go B25. Like, just bet 1.5 bigs or something,
Yeah. I tested this this week, actually. I like ran a sim while I was at work. I only did like 80 flops. I have GTO Plus. I don't have like Wizard or anything like that. But I first tested it, giving it the one big blind option with like 5 flops or something. Like, oh, it's pretty much like very rarely used, like almost never used. And I also gave it at 30 is like, I forget what it is, like 4 or 5 SPR, whatever it is. I gave it the all-in option on the flop, thinking that like there were certain dynamic boards where it might just shove all in, like a Jack 10 X with like a flush draw. But I was like it really doesn't use the all-in option or the one big blind option very often at all. Like enough that I just removed it from when I ran the 80 big blind. I was like, I don't need to give those options because it doesn't use it.
Exactly. And I think a lot of that will come down to, particularly in position, when you're in position, you don't want to cut two streets out of the game tree very often. You know, like I think there will occasionally be situations in 3-bet pots where the SPR is low enough, and there will be some ICM situations where, you know, reducing the number of streets from in position still has some merit. But for the most part, if we're just looking at like a chip EV sim, we would just rather play 3 streets. You know, there's just not that much merit to just playing an equity game instead of a decisions game. And I think the one big blind, we kind of said, like, if you just never get a fold, then eventually you would just rather check, you know? So I think just B25 as being the small size that you go with is very reasonable.
Cool.
And then, you know, the last kind of point here, I think I think almost this is like overcomplicating it to a degree. Like I kind of mentioned in the comment here that like on this kind of a board, it's hard to really identify a specific hand that like really benefits from actually checking, and what kind of exploit we would really be gaining here, because it's true that they're probably going to, you know, not bet the turn often enough. You know, they're not going to use big enough sizings on the turn and various things like that. But there's not, like, most of the hands here that kind of don't want to face a turn bet on some turns are actually strong enough that they just kind of have a good desire to bet the flop anyway, you know? I mean, you could maybe make an argument for like pocket 4s through 6s specifically wanting to check there, but I just think anything that starts out as a range bet at equilibrium, it's really hard for something to happen that makes it not a range bet anymore, unless the big blind is actually tighter than what they're supposed to be pre-flop, you know? That's probably the way that I would look at that. And then, not using big bets makes sense. All of this is pretty logical. The one thing that I think is maybe a little bit missing here is just the idea that villain would be indifferent at a lower frequency against a bigger size. You know, they just have too many easy folds in general. And then back here as well, or down here as well, this area, like ace 10 suited with a backdoor is like not an ambitious defend here. Like this against one big blind, you absolutely have to fold, to continue with ace 10 suited backdoor. Like you probably have to continue every single backdoor versus one big blind here. Like just like 10 deuce for the backdoor probably has to call that. So that's kind of the thing here, that like 3x has to continue against like B75, let alone one big blind, you know? So, it would be, I mean, I think the thresholds here and just kind of understanding how the sizings are influencing the thresholds is quite important.
I saw in some of the sims that I ran, like against the 25% on dry boards, it's like 30% raise.
A lot of the time it can
out of position, and I was like, oh, I was raising like 20% thinking that was a lot, you know, coming from cash. Like I'm like, oh yeah, 20-25% against a it's like more than I thought. So
and this is kind of the impact of having a it's kind of the impact of a scenario where both players' ranges are so much wider. It's that the preflop calling range has a lot of hands in it that on given board textures are going to be quite weak, and then that creates a range bet. But then at the same time, the fact that the entire range is betting the flop also creates situations where there's a lot of hands in that range, which will also fold to a raise. So it's like you get check and then a lot more betting and then a lot more raising, and you just get a lot of small bets, a lot of small raises, instead of this like very polar strategy where if you continue, you have to have some kind of a decent hand and so on, you know? So I certainly think that we want to get into the habit of basically recognizing that unless we're talking about like a 3-bet, 4-bet pot or something, you pretty much just don't fold a pair to a small bet. Like if you flop a pair, you just shouldn't fold it to a small bet. And even to like half pot, it's pretty rare for any kind of pair to fold unless it's like an under pair with no real outs, So yeah, certainly a lot of backdoor is going to do a lot of raising here. And then the other thing that I would mention here as well in terms of continuing versus a check raise is that there's not really a significant difference here with from continuing with a 7 compared to continuing with a 3. So I think continuing with any 5-out pair is probably a more accurate thing to sort of look at it in terms of, because if your opponent's never check raising a 7, then there's actually no difference between pocket jacks and pocket 8s. And if they're never check raising a 3, there's no difference between pocket 6s and pocket 4s. So if they're mostly check raising like strong hands and then some draws, and so it's kind of a polar range, I think it's fine to continue with any queen, any 7, and any 3, but then fold any pocket pair that only has 2 outs, right? Part of the reason why we're supposed to continue with stuff like jacks more often is because villain is supposed to occasionally check raise a 7. But if they're not doing that, then we would just rather have a 5-out pair. You could make an argument in some cases for only continuing with specifically a queen or a 7 with a backdoor or a 3 with a backdoor, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's completely fine in a lot of cases. This rule is pretty accurate, but there's a lot of situations, particularly in tournaments, where it doesn't apply as much. So there are quite a few low frequency small bet spots and also quite a few high frequency big bet spots. And we'll kind of talk about some of those to some degree, but broadly speaking, this is relatively true. There's a graphic that I built to sort of illustrate flop bet sizes and how it works that I'll show you next time. So we'll go into that next time. The ideas of advantage here, all very accurate. One thing that I would say, though, is that what we're now kind of starting to be able to understand more is that we can really talk about where the advantage exists in the range a bit more directly. So an overall equity advantage is relevant, but a lot of the time what that's a product of is an advantage at the bottom of the range where one player has more trashy hands and the other player just doesn't have any trashy hands. So in general, they have way more equity. And this is kind of what that graphic I mentioned is going to sort of explain a bit more. So none of this is incorrect, but what you will find is that there are going to be certain spots where, let's say we have an advantage at the bottom of our range and we have an advantage at the top of the range. Sometimes that'll result in like a split strategy where we have a lot of small bets and some big bets. Sometimes it'll just be only big bets. Sometimes it'll be big bets and checks. And you'll start to see more and more patterns the more you look at sims there that can kind of illustrate where the advantages lie. This is, you're right, definitely right that this is a corollary to the above here, because the overall idea here is that obviously flop interactions and equities are dependent on what the flop texture is. So this is, it's certainly going to have an impact. And there's a lot about this that's still very accurate about protection, equity denial, and stuff like that. But we do have to be just a little bit more specific about it, because it's not the texture itself that's going to alter things. It's going to be the extent to which that texture allows different distributions of hands to exist. So, for example, you'll see, it's true that larger sizes will be used on 10 high boards more often than on king high. But like I put here, 10-8-4, very different from 10-8-7.
For sure.
And then also like there will be larger sizes on like some king high connected boards that just give so much equity to the raiser. Like if you look at under the gun big blind, like king, queen, jack might be a
triple
high
Broadway.
Yeah, triple Broadway is going to be like high frequency big bet, whereas king, jack 3 would be quite different, So definitely want to get a bit more specific there. And then SPR and stack sizes, this is certainly very accurate, except for this part, because this is definitely not really a thing. Like it's not really true that optimal strategies always include geo sizes. because there's tons of situations where a geo size just doesn't present indifference at all. Like the best example there is paired boards. Like if you're playing a paired board at deep stacks, a big size just gets so many folds from trashy hands, and then you just isolate yourself against trips, and you just get stacked. Yeah, exactly. So like there's certain boards where no matter how deep you get, geo sizes just don't happen. Same with monotone, same sort of thing. Positions, definitely very relevant. Glad we mentioned this, except for maybe this last part, not quite as accurate here. There are a lot of situations where when we are out of position, the small bet doesn't really achieve indifference a lot. So particularly if we're deep, a small bet is, there's quite a lot of situations where if we bet small, we might get a fold like 10% of the time, but that just doesn't help us that much because we're growing the pot in exchange for that. So there will be a lot less c-betting from out of position for sure. But I think the interesting thing to note here is that a lot of why that's the case is to do with the fact that an in-position caller is going to have a stronger range than a big blind caller. And if we look at, for example, spots like button versus small blind, for example, right? Where the small blind is actually flatting a range that looks a little bit like a button flatting range in a lot of cases, or they're not flatting a weak range like the big blind is. You'll see there that there's a lot more passiveness from in position, and the whole structure of the strategy changes. And you can kind of experiment here with sims. If you run a sim and then you like swap the positions of the ranges to just make it's going to create a weird spot. But if you just make the out of position player in position instead, you will see changes, but quite often the actual makeup of the ranges, the hands that exist in the ranges, are actually going to have more impact than the positions. So the position is relevant here, but it's mostly relevant because it affects the ranges, basically.
I would, if I had to pick one thing that I was like least studied at, probably say this, because it just doesn't really happen in cash, like because of the rate, especially at like 100, 200 NL, it's like everyone's playing 3-bet or fold because the rake is so high. Position plotting doesn't really happen. Small blind plotting never happens. So it's like playing as the out of position player in the small blind, that's like something I really don't have much experience with at all.
Right. Well, that's something that would be good to take a look at then, because there are a lot of challenges there for tournaments. There's a lot of like interesting spots where you get to like donk the small blind and stuff like that, and people just don't do that. People don't really like. There's a lot of people who still try to get away with playing 3-bet or fold in the small blind in tournaments, and it's just like you can't do that. You just can't. So, certainly something we can look at. The ICM part here, definitely pretty accurate in the first part, but the last part, not quite accurate, just simply because there are quite a few situations where we can actually exert pretty much the same amount of fold equity with a cheaper price in ICM, because if you think about the elasticity of the opposing range, right? The more ICM pressure they are under, the more inelastic they become, to where if they face any bet, they start to fold more and more. So in fact, there are some situations where large sizes do become quite powerful in ICM, but they only become powerful in spots where there's a big gap between how much they fold to all in and how much they fold to some other size, So it's not that true that we just start to shovel in bigger bets when we have the ability to exert pressure. We'll try to speed up how fast we go through these so we can get through them today. This one is generally pretty good, but I would have liked to see overall a bit more mention of the fact that equity realization is specifically the thing that connects together EV and equity. So, the relationship between EV and equity is determined by equity realization. So all of this it's a good description of some of the mechanics of how equity realization happens, but it doesn't necessarily describe the idea that the equity realization is a distinct number that we can measure, and it's simply measured as a product of how much is this hand supposed to win if it checks down, versus how much does it actually win when players are forced to make multiple streets of decisions. So
yeah.
the way I like to look at equity realization is it basically it's a measurement of the value of multiple streets of post-flop play, right? If your hand has bad equity realization, if your hand has bad EQR, it doesn't want to play 3 streets. If your hand has really good EQR, it wants to play 3 streets, and so on, right? Then we've got this part which also accurate. Nothing inaccurate here, but again, I would have liked to see a little bit more of a focus on the idea that imbalance can exist in both directions. Imbalance can exist from the calling range too, and the caller can be exploited if they overfold and stuff like that. So this kind of connects a little bit to the MDF question later on, and we're a little bit focused on I want to protect my own range a little bit, and not focused enough on I want to attack a range that is imbalanced towards too many weak hands or something like that. Then we've got this one's pretty good. Looking back, I don't like this question that much because it's sort of it does capture a pretty important mechanic of the game, but it's also like fold equity isn't that much of a thing that we really take into account with our actual decisions, other than just how likely is it that our opponent folds. So it's this part here, like this is kind of true, but not really, because fold equity is basically just how often are they folding, and that's a product of their range more than position. So kind of like I say, not a great question. So that one's not one that's not super important. This one, also good. I would have liked to see some explanation like this about the range of outcomes and things like that in the ICM question early on, because this is definitely very sort of definitional stuff. This is all about what ICM really is. And it does help to contribute to why these kinds of factors exist. And, all your arguments here are very reasonable. So I would like to maybe see some of that earlier on. The only other thing that I think is maybe, or actually there's 2 things, I guess, the notes I have here. This aspect isn't really something we have to consider, because like I mentioned before, everybody's affected by blind increases the same way, and it's all about percent of chips in play. So this is just kind of the waiting for spots logic is like the I just want to survive logic, and we don't really want to think in those terms. And then the last part is, so this right here, like we want to be a little bit careful about assuming that a medium stack busting before a short stack is actually sacrificing a lot of their EV, because the general idea is that anytime we bust a tournament, the amount of ICM value that we lose is equal to whatever the ICM value of our stack was. But the question is, did the potential gain in that situation actually offset that? Right. So I think
that's something I disregard a lot.
Okay.
We busted before a short stack, but if we had doubled and we have, a way higher chance to win the tournament, then it's
exactly. So it kind of, you want to be careful that you don't always look at when you're a medium stack and there's a short stack there, you're like, oh, I can't bust before this short stack, right? Like there just have to be some spots where you just bust in a spot where it's like, well, I kind of wish I had laddered up, but like I just couldn't ladder in that spot. Like there's some spots that are just too good to not take. This is interesting in this next one in your response.
Was the hardest question for me, and I put it at the very
it's interesting. And like I'm going to change this question too because it's a little bit too vague. But I think that everybody who's answered this so far has complained about this question because
it's so hard.
I think what it kind of illustrates really, I guess, is that people are very prone to defaulting to what would I do here and not what's the actual reasoning process. And the thing is, you did do a pretty good job here of establishing the actual sequential process of what's their value range, how many bluffs do they need to have, like what kinds of pot odds am I getting, like all these types of things. You did consider the various relevant elements. some of it was a little bit in the wrong order, and you maybe didn't need to go so far into the combinatorics and things like that. But you gave a better answer to this than most of the people that have answered it so far, because most of the people so far have just defaulted to like, I think my opponent is never bluffing here, therefore I fold. Like the people have just done that. Some people have just like completely forgotten about the possibility of their opponent having a 9, which is like really important here. Like you can't
just like a ton of 9s.
Exactly. Like you can't just ignore a 9 here. Like we had a couple people who are just like, well, they have ace king, they have aces, they have kings, and they have boats, and it's like, what about a 9? You know what I mean? Yeah. So, and I specifically didn't state the action on the earliest streets in this because I wanted people to point that out, and I wanted people to say, well, if the action was this, then I would do this, or I wanted people to point out like, well, it depends what size they bet on the turn, depends what size they bet on the flop, and so on.
Is this an overbet board on the flop?
Depends on the formation. If we're button big blind, then not as many, not as much, because button big blind we actually have like quite a good incentive to value bet with a king. Because we don't need to check back a king, but if we're like under the gun big blind, then it becomes a bit different, and a king starts to want to check back a bit more. So it depends, basically.
Another question nitty gritty now. Do you overbets occur more often at deeper stacks than they do?
Yes, that's certainly true.
You really need to use it at 30, right?
Right. There is a sliding scale. Like the answer that you gave elsewhere, I think we haven't got to it yet, but there's an answer about the sort of scaling of bet sizes according to stacks. And it is true that sizes scale with stacks, but there's also kind of there's a cap on that to some degree, which is basically, it caps out at a certain point where in positions, positional advantage doesn't really matter much after a certain SPR, and the nut advantage can only ever be so significant that, you're not going to get like a 7x pot flop bet and stuff like that, no matter how big the SPR is. Because ultimately there is a theoretical SPR threshold where all in pots on the flop just literally never happen. And in fact, depending on the flop texture, there are quite a lot of situations where all in pots on the flop never happen one way or the other, because as soon as the in position player gets check raised, they only play call or fold. They never 3-bet the flop. So there are actually quite a few situations where the chips are never going in on the flop no matter what, no matter how big you bet. So it just like other factors start to become more relevant.
Gotcha.
All of your analysis here about what they're actually doing with certain hands is it's all valuable and useful. I think that what I would have liked to see though is kind of just defaulting a little bit more immediately to thinking about the odds that we're getting, the price that we need. You're right that this is where you kind of start confusing MDF and equity, which is like you're right about MDF here, but then we currently have a range of 55% bluffs. If that's true, you should never even think about folding a bluff catcher, because if your opponent's bluffing more than they're value betting, you can never be getting worse than 1-to-1. So like if they're bluffing more than they're value betting, you just always call, right? And that kind of comes up again later on. So I think there's just a couple of things there that we want to make sure that we avoid confusing those two, because we only need about 30% equity to call here.
Yeah.
And the reason I picked this kind of a board texture is because it's not inconceivable that basically what I wanted people to kind of pick up on here is that in a circumstance where villain had less 9x, so if they were opening early position or something, for example, if their value range was basically only ace king plus, so like only full houses, ace king, aces, kings, quad nines, etc., their value range might be restricted enough that with a 75% size, we might be in a position where we really don't have to find that many bluffs, right? So it actually could easily be a situation where bluff catching any ace could be quite reasonable, especially the ones that unblock all the bluffs, right? It's kind of why I picked this situation.
Makes sense.
So yeah, we want to definitely start with, what price are we getting? So in this particular case, you're not wrong to think about it in terms of, we're breaking down what the value range is and things like that. But you don't really have to do the combinatorics. And if it was true that they have 58 value combos, we really only need to find like, I don't know, maybe 28 or something bluff combos, which means if they bluff with all these broadways, we just call everything. So this is, these are all reasonable examples of good situations where flatting ace king could be okay. However, they're kind of missing the main mechanic here, which is that the reason ace king 3-bets or 4-bets is to get action from worse. And what I was kind of looking for here is that a situation where maybe our opponent is 3-betting so tight that they don't 3-bet ace queen, or they're going to fold ace queen to a 4-bet, or, you know, something like this. Any kind of situation really that just captures the idea that ace king is 3-betting, not just because it's ace king, but because it can get value from worse. You know, that's kind of what we're looking for there to really capture that primary mechanic, because that's true for basically all hands. Like if we can't actually get action from worse, we don't really have reason to put more chips in.
It's not going to give us a lot of situations where we shift our 3-betting range a lot against tight players. Actually, I'm thinking of like a situation where you're playing against a super nit and gash, and you're like, I'm not going to 3-bet king queen suited. If I get 4-bet, he's just going to have me smashed, and you know.
Yeah, I mean that. It's certainly the mechanics are going to drive that for sure. I think against those players, what tends to happen there is that we have more of an incentive to just be very, very polar with our 3-bets. Like we kind of immediately just have like stuff that's really, really strong and then a few bluffs. Because it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't bluff. It just means that we have very limited reason to try for any kind of thin value, right? And you do see this in ICM situations. If you look at any kind of situation where there's an ICM spot where a player, like if you look at big stack versus big stack, where your big stack opens the button, big stack is defending the big blind at a final table, the big stack in the big blind will defend quite wide, and their 3-bet range will become insanely polarized, because the only hands that can actually get it in are going to be like kings plus.
Right.
And so they start to 3-bet this crazy range of like kings plus and then a bunch of super trashy bluffs. And then they just flat everything else, right? Because they just can't get like jacks to put it in pre. So there's no reason to 3-bet queens, you know? So they prefer to just call instead. So that's kind of the main mechanic that we were looking for there. This is all good in terms of explaining the principles of how solvers work. I think what I would have maybe preferred to see is just a bit more of a fleshing out of this sentence right here, where we're kind of talking about the way that we use solvers is to understand the mechanics and be able to sort of take the math and turn it into strategies that we can actually employ and things that we can understand in a more human way. Just kind of using it as a translator for the math, essentially. Because a lot of the time we're not really going to know what our opponent's frequencies are, right? We're not really going to know that this guy's only doing it 25%. He's supposed to do it this amount. Like we quite often are just going to be generally looking at like, okay, you're supposed to do this a lot. I don't think they are doing this a lot.
Exactly.
How does the mechanic kind of shift me in one direction or another? So again, none of it's wrong. Just maybe a little bit focus could be different. This is a pretty reasonable approach here, but I think it's interesting that you kind of went straight to like the exploitative aspect of the fact that this player is fairly loose and aggressive, more so than actually explaining what this kind of standard approach would be, right? Because it's like none of what you say here about the adaptations is necessarily wrong. It's just that I don't know from this answer what your idea about a standard defense range in this spot actually looks like. So I can't really judge whether or not you might actually be in the right territory until we kind of have we need to explain what this approach looks like, right? So the only other thing that I would say here is you said to start, I think we can do both and see how it responds overall here. You can't do both. Like you can't 3-bet more linearly and at the same time be more polarized. You know what I mean? Like you can expand your 3-bet range and keep it polar, so it can be a wider range of it can still be a polar range and it can be wider for value, which means it also has more bluffs.
Right.
But that's an expansion of our value range and an expansion of our bluffing range to mirror that. If we were to 3-bet more linearly, it would imply that we would be essentially just reducing the frequency of bluffs altogether, right? So it's kind of either one thing or the other. Either we're not really expecting to get any folds, in which case we're only really 3-betting thin value stuff, or we are 3-betting a bit more polar because we do expect to get some folds and we're just maybe widening up the value range.
Yeah.
If anything, though, what I was kind of hoping for here in terms of a response, I didn't really put it in the notes, but I was hoping to see just like, okay, he's loose aggressive and he's under the gun 9. Like, I'm just going to treat him as if he's an under the gun 7 opener and just do that, just like take that and then have that be my baseline. Because the thing is that if we're looking at what a standard defense would be against under the gun 9, even before we know anything else, if we know that the opening range is wider, then the appropriate response there against a wider opening range is going to look virtually identical to an under the gun 7 defense, So this is kind of, if somebody's wider, this is kind of what I think we can quite easily do. And if somebody's tighter, same thing. Just like if they're a little bit wider or a little bit tighter, just take the strategy against one position earlier, one position later. And if they're a lot tighter or a lot wider, go 2 positions. Maybe go 3 positions if you need to. But this would be, I think the way to approach it. And then everything else that goes beyond this is like, just knowing that our opponent is loose aggressive, it's a little bit, it's almost a bit of an over adjustment. Like, I don't think we can necessarily start taking all of our mixed call fold hands and just folding them just based on the fact that villain is a bit more aggro, because again, we have to know where that threshold is to begin with. So, we just, there's just a couple of things to tweak there. Then we've got, the mixed strategies answer. So this is all kind of a very reasonable explanation here. I think, this, I think the direction your answer went in here is kind of interesting, because from this point onwards here, you pretty much deviated into explaining spots where we're not mixing, or explaining spots where not mixing is a good idea. And you're not wrong about any of it, but in fact, it's not really addressing the question about a situation where mixing itself would be really good, right? And what I was kind of looking for here is an example of a spot where, an example of a spot where mixing would be important for us to actually implement in practice is simply, we're in a spot where we know that the EV of all 3 actions is very close together, and or even just 2 actions is very close together. And specifically, we're up against an opponent that either we know is a very good player, or if we simply don't know enough about our opponent to make an accurate assumption about the EV of which action is going to be higher. And so that's a situation where mixing itself would be useful. And what you've kind of done here is, at the bottom, you've said, then again, if villain is a weaker player, it probably changes the EV. You're right. Wait, I guess you repeated yourself here. If the villain is a weaker player, we might want to 3-bet them more often. But then again, if the villain is a weaker player, it probably changes the EV of this hand.
Yeah, I wrote that with the assumption that like the EV of the actions is equal, but like if the villain's weaker, then one is probably higher than the other.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I see what you mean. But I think the main thing here is that there's nothing that really addresses the idea of what we should do if our opponent isn't a weaker player, right? Like, if our opponent is actually a bit stronger, we might need to mix. It might actually be helpful to mix, because we could be subject to a lot of cognitive bias if we try to choose between 2 actions that in fact are actually equal at equilibrium, right? So that's kind of the idea there. This one was very good overall about cold calling, like very reasonable assumptions to make. Like, they're probably a fish. They're probably pretty weak. I don't think we want to go too far into like specific hands, because if we just see them cold call 3-bets, it's definitely reasonable to assume that they're a fish, but there are different types of fish within this boundary. Like, there's the kind of tight fish that takes like ace king and just doesn't want to cold 4-bet because cold 4-bets feel like they're scary strong for him. So scary for him. Yeah, exactly. But there's also the player that like they have a pair and they just don't want to fold a pair. So yeah, precisely. Right. Like, so I think it's enough to say like this player is probably a fish. They're probably pretty passive, but as far as how wide that range is going or how tight they might be and whether or not they might have traps, which again, we don't really know with a lot of players. I think we want to be a little careful about going too far with that, but generally all of this very reasonable. Yeah, this one's interesting. This is probably the fault of, I'm going to blame Berkey for this one because I think Berkey used these terms interchangeably a lot in a situation where I don't really think they are. And I always tried to get him to shift towards using linear because the way he applied the term merged was more referring to a linear range. But the way that I like to sort of describe these ranges now is that it's all about the source of where the EV is being generated from. So if a range is linear, it's a range that is pretty much clearly definable as only being value, where it's hands that are almost exclusively gaining EV through getting action from worse. So they're almost exclusively gaining EV from hands that they're actually ahead of. A merged range contains some hands which are gaining EV from maybe more than one different source. So for example, this is a good example here, Queen Jack suited. There are a lot of spots where Queen Jack suited will 3-bet specifically because it has the ability to simultaneously get King Queen off to fold, but also get Jack 10 suited to call, right? So it's actually gaining EV from two sources at the same time. Whereas something like Ace Jack suited is not going to get ace. Well, I mean, probably not going to get Ace Queen to fold. And therefore that's kind of much more consistent with a linear range. So stuff like 6-5 suited, Ace-5 suited, those are still going to be present in a merged range because they do occasionally get folds from better. They occasionally get calls from worse. They have tons of equity even when they do get called by stuff they're flipping against and so on, right? So a merged range is it's a good sort of deep stack concept because it kind of captures the idea that board coverage and various different factors are also going to affect the EVs of these hands. But everything here about polar ranges, all very accurate. Pretty good reasoning here. All seems good. This MDF explanation here is all accurate, except for it's a little short. I would have liked to see a bit more on this one. And I also think, again, kind of like earlier, really important that we reference the fact that MDF tells us the threshold where our own bluffs start to actually make money. So it tells us where if villain is folding more than X, we just always bluff, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the more important practical application because it's not usually that significant whether we're allowing villain to hypothetically profit with their bluffs or not, but it is very significant if we can identify, well, I don't think they're going to meet MDF here. I don't think they're going to call half the time against a pot size bet. I always I have to bluff everything, right? This one, all very good. I like this explanation here about the value of bluffing. The only thing I would say here is that like the idea that we need to have multiple sizes here may or may not be true. It's sometimes going to be true. It's sometimes not. The general idea is that spots where multiple sizes are going to exist, particularly on the river, it's going to be spots where there's multiple different potential value bet regions that we can have. So we might have, I kind of explained here, but we might have like a size which is like a queen that's value betting smaller, and then a size that's like a king or better. Or we might even have a queen, a king, or the small frequency of stuff that might be better than a king. Like we might have 3 sizes, but depending on the spot, there will be certain circumstances where we just don't need to have multiple sizes because of the nature of the ranges. Yeah, so this one here, MDF being 50% means we want a 1-to-1 ratio of value bets to bluffs. Again, this is confusing pot odds and MDF. Yeah, so you're right. The funny thing is this is correct, right? This is exactly correct. And then this next sentence is kind of restating the same thing, but wrong, right? It's like, it's the same thing, but it's an incorrect version of it.
It's a 2-to-1 and then I changed it to 1-to-1.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of funny, but basically, yeah, we never need to have more bluffs and value bets. We just get closer and closer to that 1-to-1 threshold as the bet size gets bigger, basically. This ICM one, I think, is interesting. I think that the main thing I
think this question was really tough for me. Can I reread the question?
Of course, yeah. So on a bubble with 12 players left, you're the chip leader and two short stacks shoved before you with medium stacks still behind. I think what I was kind of wanting to highlight here, or the reason for including this question, was to hone in on, first of all, the idea that even when we're the chip leader, we're never going to be wider than chip EV, right? We're not going to suddenly call wider because we're not getting like a better price, right? We're not getting an overlay in the pot just because we're the chip leader, unless there's like bounties in play. Bounties are a different thing altogether. But the idea here is we're still going to be tighter than chip EV. But in fact, the thing that I wanted to hone in on this question is, even if our risk premium is low, the shoving ranges of the two stacks ahead of us are likely to be very, very tight. And so this is an example of a spot where, even though there isn't really any significant amount of ICM pressure on us, the simple fact that we're up against very tight ranges means we probably call very tight anyway. Because even if we had no risk premium at all, if the ranges that are shoving are really tight, we have no reason to call with like a chip EV calling range, right? So that's kind of the thing here. But yeah, generally, the logic isn't inaccurate. It's just kind of, we're never going wider than chip EV in an all-in situation.
So
sorry, go ahead.
How do we know that the shoving ranges are tight just because the short stack shoved over enough?
Well, if
the nature of the formation,
if we're on a bubble, they are subject to a lot of risk premium, right? Yeah. So when they are subject to risk premium, their shoving ranges are going to be tighter than chip EV. And it's compounding because the initial shoving range is tighter, and then the second shoving range is also tighter than chip EV. So the combined sort of width of those ranges is significantly tighter than what it would be if it was chip EV. Yeah. And then we have a slight risk premium applied to us as well, because we're risking a good amount of chips, or we don't know exactly how many, but we're risking a certain amount of chips. So in a chip EV scenario, it's quite interesting. In some chip EV spots where there's two all-ins ahead of you, quite often it can be surprising how much equity certain hands have against two shoving ranges. Like there will be spots where you're supposed to call like queen jack suited against two shoves because you just have good equity. But here, like we might fold jacks in spots here, right? Like we might just be super tight because the ranges of two players being all in on the bubble are just going to be super tight, right? That's kind of the thing. Then we have the multi-way one. This is really good overall. I think this one, everything seems very, very logical here. It's really hard to imagine being at a low enough SPR that we would want to just shove the flop. It's quite.
Well, I know that now after running the sims.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, certainly check shoving a lot is good. Deeper stacks, checking more. It is relevant here if we're looking at multi-way, that the number of players that have position on us versus that we have position on matters quite a bit. So you're very correct here about this first part, but it's also relevant that as stacks get deeper, the downside of it's like a compounding effect that in heads up, being out of position is more damaging at deeper stacks. In multi-way, if we are out of position against more than one player, that's amplified even further when stacks are deeper. And if we're in position against more than one player, that's also amplified further. So there's kind of an interesting thing that happens where, let's say you go four ways to a flop and it's like you open, the button calls, and then both blinds also call. In some instances there, the fact that the two weakest ranges in the hand are both out of position against you actually allows you to be quite aggressive, because the one player having position on you isn't enough to offset your ability to play aggressively against the two out of position players. So there's a lot of variables there, obviously, but yeah, you're identifying the right things. So nothing really wrong there. And then the final one, the only thing I would say about this blockers question is you're a little bit too focused on unblockers and not actually on blockers themselves, right? So I would have, the kind of example I was expecting people to give here was basically just having the nut flush blocker on a 3 flush board. Like that's the stuff where having a suit blocker those types of things matter a lot more. Stuff like unblocking the folds is relevant, but we don't often want to kind of jump straight towards that. We want to think a little bit more, particularly on rivers, we want to think a bit more about ensuring that we have good blockers to the regions of hands that are going to call. And that's especially going to be true on, flush boards, straight boards, things like that. The board that you've given here, where there's no completed draws or anything, it's like a really blank board. This is a good example of a board where unblockers are quite relevant. But on a board where, let's say, there are more draws that complete, unblockers become a lot less relevant, and actual blockers, have to become more significant. So, I mean, it is a tricky spot to know what our bluffs should contain here, but it's also the case that, it's not really that big of a deal here if we're unblocking some of the folds, because we're also, in this case, if we look at Queen, Jack, 10 type hands, well, we're also blocking stuff like King, Queen, King, Jack, King, 10. So sometimes it neutralizes, right? So it wouldn't be a disaster here to bluff with a lot of those hands by any means. But the general idea of unblockers, like, you're applying these ideas very accurately, but I would have liked to see a bit more about potentially pre-flop applications of blockers, which you're accurate here about. They matter more in polarized situations. They also matter more in narrow range situations. So I would have liked to see a bit more about that, and then a bit more about
the difference between those. You said in polarized situations and in narrow range situations.
A polarized situation would be like a situation where we're 3-betting from the big blind and we're 3-betting for a big size. So because we're 3-betting for a bigger size, we are less focused on post-flop playability. And so the primary factor that's going to influence the EV of our 3-bet is going to be how many folds we get, which is why we want to have more blockers. And then a narrow range spot would be, let's say if we think about, responding to a 4-bet, right? If we were going to 5-bet bluff, the reason why we would be more inclined towards blockers there, regardless of what size we were 5-betting for, would simply be that if the range of hands that villain is going to get it all in with gets so narrow that it's basically only aces, the narrower that range gets, the more powerful any individual single blocker becomes, right? So it's fold equity, and then it's like actually reducing that top of range. If our opponent's getting it in with the top 20% of the deck, then blocking one ace just doesn't matter, right? Makes sense.
I think there was a Yuri video on Upswing that really opened my eyes to that. He's like, you shouldn't have one 3-betting range, or you can consider not having one 3-betting range. You can have one for players who you think will mostly fold to your 3-bets, and one for players who you think will mostly call it. And I was like, it makes perfect sense. Why have I never thought of that before?
Right. It's polarity versus linearity, or polarity versus merging. Yeah, absolutely. That's a completely reasonable exploitative adaptation for sure. So I think just as a whole here, good direction to go in for next time would be like, like I said, I'll show you the document that's kind of designed to flesh out the flop c-bets, and just looking at how to take concepts like advantage and kind of make them into something that's a little bit more intelligible to actually build strategies. And then we'll also, I think in other sessions, we'll take a look at some river concepts, and maybe just kind of make sure that some of your ideas about bluff catching and about how you're actually trying to exploit in various cases, and trying to figure out, like, is villain meeting MDF and things like that. Just kind of make sure that some of those ideas are in the right territory. But, all of this definitely really helpful to get a sense of what's going on. I think obviously the majority of it really good. A lot of the ideas I think are very much in the right direction. It's just some refinement in certain areas, and a couple of areas where some of the things that seem to sort of be top of mind for you were not quite in line with what the most important aspects actually are. But broadly, a lot of good signs, a lot of positives. So we'll just kind of keep working on some of those mechanics, and keep building up your ability to sort of implement things in more precise ways. And I think we should be on the right track.
Cool. Is this one going to be on YouTube? Because it was my assessment, or like I don't mind either way. I just want the recording of this because you said a lot of great things that I need to like go back and listen to.
Sure. Okay. Well, what I can do is I'll drop the recording. I'll drop the raw recording for you on Discord anyway,
Cool.
and then I'll put it up on YouTube as well. But that'll take longer because I have to edit and everything.
Yeah.
But I'll just drop you the raw
no, you had
recording
some
on
really
YouTube.
great nuggets. I'm like, I need to go back and listen to that again for sure. So
Cool. All right. Well, glad to hear it. Glad it was effective. So yeah, if you want to, you can also go back into the booking link. You should be able to go ahead and book your next one. So if you want to get set up for next week or something, then feel free.
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. All right, man. Well, talk to you soon then, and
Appreciate
good luck in the meantime. All right.
Yeah, have a good one.
See ya. You too. Bye.